In this video, we are going to be breaking down why Bikini Bottom has gone quiet and what that quiet actually means. Let's get started with the moment the town forgets to breathe. Tonight, the silence does not feel like calm. It feels like a clinical malfunction, the kind of stillness that makes you rethink what a town is supposed to sound like. You remember Saturday mornings when the noise from the screen poured into your living room like a second heartbeat. The bubbling, the laughter, the chaos, all of it forming a rhythm that felt alive. Now that rhythm is gone. The absence becomes its own presence. It becomes a void that stretches across the ocean floor like a forgotten memory, something familiar yet impossibly distant. When a place built on noise becomes quiet, the quiet itself becomes suspicious. What we are hearing is not peace. It is a kind of environmental shutdown. The currents feel slower, as if the ocean is holding back. The lights in the windows seem dimmer, not because they're fading, but because the world around them has stopped participating. It feels like the town has collectively exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. This is not rest. This is a pause so long that it turns into a question. Either the town is waiting for something, or it is hiding from something, and both possibilities create the same heavy stillness. You can feel that tension the way you feel late night anxiety settle into your chest. The quiet becomes a liminal space, a moment between moments, where nothing is happening, yet everything feels aware of itself. The buildings feel like they are listening. The streets feel like they are remembering. Even the shadows seem to hesitate before moving. Silence should feel empty, but here it feels crowded. It carries the weight of something unspoken, something that refuses to surface. You can sense that the quiet is not natural. It is reactive, like the town is responding to a threat you cannot see. This is where the adult lens sharpens the picture. As kids, a quiet cartoon meant a commercial break or a slow scene. As adults, quiet feels clinical. It feels diagnostic. In human terms, when someone suddenly stops speaking, the silence is not a random event. It is data. It is a symptom. Either they are suppressing something or something has suppressed them. Bikini Bottom's silence follows that same logic. It is a deviation from baseline behavior, a red flag disguised as tranquility. And as you look at this world through the tired eyes of someone who has lived through burnout, through long nights at work, through those moments when your own mind goes blank from exhaustion, the silence starts to resemble something else. It resembles collapse. Not loud collapse, but slow, quiet, internal collapse. The kind where everything keeps standing, yet nothing feels alive. Because silence is not safety. It is a symptom that spreads, and as it spreads through Bikini Bottom, the first thing it attacks is routine. The very rhythm that once kept this strange little world alive. You can feel it the way you feel your own rituals unravel when burnout creeps in. One day, you wake up and the familiar motions feel distant. The things that used to anchor you start slipping out of your hands. That same unraveling is happening here. The town that once treated noise as a lifeline is now withdrawing from it, almost as if the silence is a protective reflex rather than an accident. In psychology, this kind of withdrawal is not random. It is dissociation, a quiet retreat from reality when the mind feels overwhelmed. And the moment SpongeBob stops laughing, the moment Patrick stops yelling, the moment Squidward stops sighing, you can sense that dissociation spreading like a soft fog through the streets. The characters are not resting. They are unplugging from the world that once demanded constant performance. A place built on motion is now choosing stillness, not because it wants to, but because it no longer remembers how to move. Think back to the way cartoons once felt as a kid. They were loud, chaotic, almost fever dream energy, the kind of sensory overload that made Saturday mornings unforgettable. Now, imagine stripping all that noise away. The silence does not feel empty. It feels like a personality shift. It feels like a town forgetting who it is supposed to be. This is not peace. This is identity displacement. When the routines break, the sense of self follows. Either the town is protecting itself from something too large to confront, or it is collapsing inward from sheer exhaustion. Both explanations lead to the same unsettling truth. What makes this quiet so unnerving is how synchronized it feels. Collective dissociation is rare, but when it happens, it is because a system can no longer regulate its own chaos. Bikini Bottom thrived on absurdity. The joke, physics. The constant noise, the endless motion. That was its baseline. That was its equilibrium. But when that equilibrium becomes too heavy to sustain, the system retreats. It shuts down emotionally. It pulls its energy back like someone folding into themselves during a panic attack. The stillness here is not random. It is a survival instinct masquerading as calm. And you can sense a tremor beneath it, the question hanging in the quiet. A town that once erupted with laughter is now afraid of its own voice. The silence is not a pause, it is a tremble, a hesitation, a kind of cognitive disconnection where the entire environment forgets what normal is supposed to sound like. When SpongeBob does not initiate joy, the town does not know how to imitate it. When Patrick does not create noise, the world stops reacting. When Squidward does not complain, the emotional counterweight disappears entirely. The whole ecosystem loses balance. You have lived moments like this, days when the routine breaks and suddenly you are not sure what version of yourself will show up. The silence in those moments feels heavy, not because the world is quiet, but because your identity has stepped back from itself. That same emotional vacancy is happening here. The town has not died. It has dissociated. It has slipped into a psychological, liminal space where nothing feels wrong, yet nothing feels alive. Because when laughter stops, the echo tells a darker story, and that darker story continues as the ocean itself begins to fall silent in a way that feels almost biological. The water around Bikini Bottom no longer hums with its usual rhythm. You can sense it the way you sense a room when the air conditioner suddenly shuts off, leaving a hollow quiet that feels heavier than sound. The ocean is supposed to carry life in its movement. Currents are supposed to drift, pressure is supposed to rise and fall. But tonight, everything feels paused, as if the sea has forgotten how to function. You remember how those old VHS cartoons sounded? The bubbling ambiance filling the background like a gentle heartbeat. The ocean always felt alive. It breathed, it whispered, it carried energy even in its still moments. But now the water behaves like a system experiencing failure. In medical terms, this is a systemic shutdown. The body stops sending signals, not because it is calm, but because it is confused. The silence becomes a symptom of internal collapse, the kind that emerges when every mechanism inside a living organism begins to malfunction at the same time. Look closer at the environment. The currents are not slow. They are absent. The sand at the bottom does not drift. It waits. The coral does not sway. It stands stiff, trapped in a strange stasis. This is what it looks like when a world forgets to circulate itself. When movement ends, so does life support. Either the ocean is choosing stillness as a form of protection, or it is losing the capacity to sustain itself. And both explanations lead to the same eerie conclusion. Something vital has stopped responding. When you apply the adult lens, the ocean transforms from scenery into a patient. The town is not just quiet, it is symptomatic. Every missing sound becomes a piece of data. Every unmoving current becomes a sign of deeper dysfunction. The silence feels diagnostic, like a doctor listening for a heartbeat and finding only a long, unsettling pause. As kids, we never noticed how often the ocean filled the silence. As adults, that missing background noise becomes impossible to ignore. The world is not resting, it is short-circuiting. And this creates a strange emotional dissonance. The ocean should feel comforting. It should feel like the soft blue blanket that covered your childhood afternoons. But tonight, it feels like a life support machine blinking without power. A place that once held life with ease is now holding its breath, not out of peace, but out of uncertainty. You can feel that uncertainty ripple into you. It feels like the kind of exhaustion you know too well, the kind where you stop moving not because you are relaxed, but because you no longer have the energy to continue. This silence is not accidental. It is coordinated. A world does not stop speaking unless something is interfering with the mechanism that produces sound in the first place. And so the ocean becomes the first witness. It holds the secret. It carries the message that something deeper, something structural, has begun to fail. Because when the environment stops speaking, something else is about to, and that something arrives in the form of a question so simple that it becomes unsettling. Either Bikini Bottom is resting or it is dying. There is no third option. There is no hidden middle ground where everything is fine. The silence forces the choice. The way late night thoughts trap you between believing you are exhausted or believing you are falling apart. A world cannot be vibrant and motionless at the same time. The quiet demands an answer, even if the town is too still to provide one. When you look at Bikini Bottom now, the stillness feels intentional. Not peaceful, but choreographed. It resembles the kind of deep breath people take after years of pushing themselves beyond their limits. The breath you take when you finally stop pretending everything is okay. Maybe you think the town is recovering. Maybe this is what it looks like when a chaotic world finally prioritizes rest. But then, the other possibility intrudes with equal weight. What if this is not rest at all? What if this is collapse? Not dramatic collapse, but the quiet kind that happens so slowly you only notice it once everything has already begun to fade. Either explanation rewrites the silence. If the town is healing, the quiet becomes medicine, a soft moment of recovery after decades of animated chaos. If the town is dying, then the quiet becomes decay, the sound of systems winding down, losing function, slipping toward an ending it cannot articulate. Both possibilities cannot coexist. One eliminates the other, and the more you listen, the more the silence begins to tilt toward one truth, then the other, then back again, as if even the world itself cannot decide what story it wants to tell you. This is where the binary ultimatum takes hold. The silence is not neutral. It points in one direction or the other. The stillness in the streets looks like rest until you notice how long it lasts. The dimness in the windows looks like sleep until it begins to resemble abandonment. The lack of movement looks like a pause until it starts feeling like the first stage of disappearance. This is the paradox that wraps around the town like a blanket and a warning at the same time. Healing or dying, recovery or decline. The same symptoms lead to both diagnoses. And you feel this tension because you have lived this question yourself. You have had nights where your exhaustion felt like relief and also like danger. Moments where your silence felt like healing and also like numbness. Times when stepping back felt responsible but also felt like you were losing pieces of yourself. This is why the binary fits so tightly around Bikini Bottom. It mirrors the way adult life collapses routines into ultimatums. Either you are recharging or you are shutting down. Either you are coping or you are breaking. Both cannot be true at once, even though they feel identical in the moment. The town sits inside that same contradiction. Its silence is too deep to read and too heavy to ignore, and so the ultimatum becomes a lens through which you view every unmoving corner of the ocean floor. If this is rest, the town will breathe again. If this is decay, something inside it has already begun to fail. Because if a town cannot choose between living and dying, something will choose for it, and that is the moment when the silence begins to bend. It stops feeling like a verdict and starts feeling like a doorway, a slow pivot from fear into something softer, something older. When the world stops moving, your mind does not stop with it. It drifts backward. It rewinds. The stillness of Bikini Bottom becomes a kind of accidental time machine, pulling you into memories you did not know were still stored inside you. Silence has a way of doing that. It turns the present into an echo chamber where the past begins to speak again. You start remembering how this world once sounded on a Saturday morning when the TV glow filled your living room like a tiny lighthouse guiding you through childhood. You remember the bubbling noises, the bright colors, the chaotic laughter that felt like the soundtrack to a simpler life. Those memories rise now because the silence creates space for them. It becomes the blank page where old moments rewrite themselves. The stillness is no longer threatening. It is familiar in a way you cannot fully explain. It feels like walking into a room you have not visited in years, yet instantly recognizing the shape of the air. This shift is not random. When the present loses its volume, the mind compensates by filling the void with the past. Psychologists call this a retrieval response, but to you it feels like nostalgia waking up from a long nap. Scenes you forgot suddenly return with clarity. SpongeBob's laugh, Patrick's confusion, Squidward's tired sighs. All of it comes back, not as noise, but as reminders of who you were before life became complicated. The quiet becomes a bridge between who you were and who you are now. What once felt like an eerie hush now feels like a pause that lets you reconnect with yourself. The edges of the town blur and the world takes on that liminal quality you felt as a kid during late night reruns, when the house was dark and the screen was the only thing alive. The silence of Bikini Bottom mirrors the silence of your own room at that age, when imagination filled every gap and the simplest colors felt like core memories forming in real time. The stillness tonight taps into that same space. It pulls you back not through fear but through recognition. And slowly, the quiet becomes comforting. It becomes a thread that ties every version of you together. As the town remains frozen, your mind begins to wander through old episodes, old feelings, old meanings you never noticed until adulthood gave you the language to understand them. The quiet turns into perspective. It lets you see how far you have traveled, how much you have carried, and how much of your identity was shaped in front of a glowing screen that played these strange little underwater stories. The loop begins here. The silence drifts into memory, and the memory drifts back into understanding. The past and present fold into each other until they feel indistinguishable. Bikini Bottom does not move, yet somehow you do. You travel backwards through the noise that shaped your childhood and forward into the meaning you were too young to see at the time. Because in the quiet, memory becomes louder than reality, and once those memories wake up, they bring back something we rarely admit we depended on. There was a time when noise did not overwhelm us, it protected us. The clatter of Bikini Bottom, the chaotic soundscape of bubbles and shouts, the fever dream energy of joke after joke, all of it wrapped around us like a shield. You remember those days. You remember sitting on the floor with a bowl of cereal while the TV filled the room with motion. Back then, noise was not a distraction. It was structure. It was the rhythm that kept your world from feeling empty. As kids, we never called it overstimulation. We called it Saturday morning. We called it normal. We called it safe. The chaos did not threaten us because it mirrored the internal chaos of childhood, where everything felt loud and nothing felt permanent. Noise became the surrogate for stability. It became the emotional anchor. The more Bikini Bottom yelled, the more grounded we felt. The characters made decisions for us, reacted for us, laughed for us. Their volume filled the space where our own uncertainty lived. And that created a strange form of psychological comfort. One we only recognize now that adulthood has taken that noise away. In adulthood, silence is not peaceful. Silence becomes an empty hallway where your thoughts echo louder than they should. When the episodes fall quiet, you begin to feel that same sensation. The absence does not feel like calm. It feels like a missing heartbeat. A world that once hummed now sits still, and that stillness awakens a kind of cognitive dissonance. Either the noise meant something all along, or it meant nothing, and both possibilities force you to confront how deeply you relied on it. The binary edges of that realization make the silence feel sharp. You return to these episodes because their chaos once held you together. It was consistency in a life that had none. The clatter, the yelling, the slapstick violence that somehow never hurt anyone. All of it formed a predictable cycle. You knew SpongeBob would laugh. You knew Patrick would misunderstand. You knew Squidward would sigh in the same tired register he always used. That repetition became a kind of emotional safety net. The way background chatter in a coffee shop makes you feel less alone even when no one is talking to you. The noise told you the world was functioning. Now, when that noise disappears, the effect is reversed. The quiet becomes suspicious, not soothing. It tells you something is missing, something is off, something is unresolved. Suddenly, the silence inside Bikini Bottom mirrors the silence inside your own adulthood, the kind that creeps in after long work days, after late night screens, after burnout strips away your ability to react. The absence of chaos does not feel like rest. It feels like losing contact with something that once kept you afloat. And this is where nostalgia does its real work. The memories step forward to replace the missing sound. They reconstruct the world you remember, not because the world needs rebuilding, but because your mind is desperately searching for the stability that noise once gave you. The quiet forces you inward, and the inward is where the childhood version of you still listens for the laughter that meant everything was okay. Because if noise meant safety, what does silence mean now? Especially when the loudest sound in Bikini Bottom was always SpongeBob's laugh. That high-pitched burst of optimism that felt impossible to ignore. As kids, we treated it like a joke, a catchphrase, a noise that existed simply because cartoons were supposed to be noisy. But when you listen to it with adult ears, something shifts. The laugh stops sounding spontaneous. It starts sounding rehearsed. It becomes clear that SpongeBob was not just laughing. He was performing resilience, manufacturing joy the way burnt-out adults force a smile in the break room so no one notices the exhaustion gathering behind their eyes. His laugh was a ritual. It repeated with the same cadence, the same intensity, the same mechanical rhythm, as if he had trained himself to deploy happiness on command. This is not how natural joy works. This is how coping mechanisms work. When someone is afraid of silence, they fill it with noise. When someone is afraid of their own thoughts, they drown them out with reflexive cheerfulness. SpongeBob did not just laugh because he was happy. He laughed because the world expected him to be happy. And when someone is trapped inside that expectation, the performance becomes survival. You remember characters like him from your own childhood. The classmate who was always on. The friend who cracked jokes even when their eyes looked tired. At the time, you thought they were just funny. Now you understand they were creating sound to keep the darkness at bay. SpongeBob embodies that same tension. His laugh acted like a buffer, a shield against the cognitive dissonance of living in a chaotic, unpredictable world. The more unstable the situation, the louder he laughed, as if volume could compensate for fear. But tonight, the laugh is missing, and its absence exposes what it was designed to conceal. Without that noise, the town feels unregulated, unprotected. You start to notice how many scenes depended on that sound to maintain emotional balance. It filled the dead air. It smoothed over conflict. It prevented the viewer from noticing the small fractures in SpongeBob's world, the loneliness that flickered in the gaps between jokes. Now those gaps have expanded. They are no longer hidden behind sound, they are bare. This raises the question we were never supposed to ask. Was SpongeBob's joy real, or was it denial wrapped in enthusiasm? Was he genuinely happy, or was he terrified of what would surface if he stopped smiling long enough to look at his own life? Either his laughter was a true expression of innocence, or it was a form of emotional self-preservation, and both interpretations change how we understand him. His laugh either connected him to the world or protected him from it. Both cannot be true at the same time. When you watch him now, in the silence, you begin to see the character differently. His old episodes replay in your mind, and you notice how often he laughed at nothing, how often he laughed to diffuse tension, how often he laughed when things were objectively falling apart. The sound becomes a code, a message, a coping technique you were too young to decode back then. Because the absence of laughter reveals the truth. Laughter was designed to hide. The silence pulls your attention towards someone you never expected to notice in moments like this. Patrick, the character who was always defined by noise, by clueless interruptions, by the kind of stupidity that felt safe because it never asked anything of you. But now he is quiet, not vacant, not distracted, but genuinely quiet in a way that feels intentional. His stillness no longer resembles confusion. It resembles contemplation, the kind of pause a person takes when a thought finally reaches them after years of drifting. And that shift forces you into a binary you cannot escape. Either Patrick's mind has finally broken under the weight of the world, or it has finally awakened. Nothing in between. A character who lived his life in a state of perpetual cognitive fog now sits with a posture that almost looks aware. His eyes do not dart. His mouth does not fall open. His expression does not scramble for the next joke. Instead, he holds the silence the way a monk holds breath. It is eerie because it contradicts everything you remember. It is soothing because it suggests depth where we were taught to expect emptiness. You grew up laughing at Patrick's mistakes, believing his ignorance was his defining trait. But in this stillness, the jokes you remember start to rearrange themselves. You begin to wonder if those mistakes were really misunderstandings, or if they were moments where he simply did not feel the need to perform intelligence. Some people stay quiet because they are lost. Others stay quiet because they are observing. And now, watching Patrick in this frozen town, you cannot decide which version you are looking at. This is the paradox that makes his silence so hypnotic. If Patrick has succumbed to true cognitive decline, then the quiet is a sign of collapse, the moment where the mind retreats so far into itself that it no longer responds to the world. But if Patrick has slipped into emotional awareness, then the quiet is enlightenment, a rare moment of clarity where he finally sees the world without distraction. Both interpretations are extreme. Both interpretations rewrite who Patrick has always been, and both cannot coexist. You notice how his stillness changes the energy around him. In a loud world, Patrick was easy to ignore. In a silent one, he becomes impossible to look away from. The absence of movement turns him into a focal point, a question mark sitting beneath a rock-shaped roof. His quiet becomes symbolic. Either he knows nothing, or he knows too much. Either he is the least aware person in the ocean, or he has been quietly studying the world from a distance we never appreciated. The silence makes both interpretations feel equally valid. This forces you to confront another truth. Patrick was always the emotional mirror of the viewer, the character who lived without overthinking. But now, in this frozen town, he resembles the listener themselves, stuck between burnout and awakening, unsure if stillness means collapse or clarity. His silence becomes your silence reflected back at you. Because either he knows nothing or he knows too much. Your attention drifts to the one character who wore silence long before the town ever fell quiet. Squidward was always subdued, always tired, always visibly carrying the weight of a world he never asked to be part of. But this silence is different. It is stripped of sarcasm, stripped of annoyance, stripped of the weary irritation that once defined him. What remains is a kind of emotional stillness that does not feel chosen. It feels imposed, the way burnout imposes itself on adults who have spent too many years pushing through days that never seem to end. Squidward's quiet now lacks flavor. It lacks bite. It lacks the tiny sparks of life that used to flicker in his sighs and complaints. Instead, his stillness resembles dissociation. When a person has been overwhelmed for too long, their mind creates distance, not to protect, but to survive. Squidward sits in that distance. His body remains in Bikini Bottom, but his presence is somewhere far away, tucked behind the kind of numbness that forms when exhaustion becomes chronic. You have felt that numbness yourself. The evenings when you stop reacting not because nothing matters, but because everything matters too much. In childhood, Squidward was the character adults were supposed to relate to. You laughed at his misery without understanding it. You laughed because you thought he was dramatic. Now, watching him in this unnatural hush, his stillness feels familiar. It feels like the emotional shutdown that comes after years of micro disappointments, corporate fatigue, overstimulation, and the quiet pressure to hold yourself together even when you feel the seams tearing. His silence becomes a mirror held up to every moment. You swallowed your frustration because expressing it required energy you no longer had. This is not peace. Peace has softness. Peace has breath. Squidward's quiet has none. It is rigid, suspended, the way a person freezes when their life becomes too heavy to carry another step forward. His clarinet sits untouched, his eyes unfocused, his mouth set in a line that looks less like annoyance and more like surrender. Either Squidward is resting, or he has reached the point where rest no longer restores him. When burnout collapses into dissociation, the world does not disappear. It simply fades into the background of a mind that cannot participate anymore. The absence of irritation is what makes this so unsettling. Annoyance meant he still cared enough to react. Sarcasm meant he still had emotional energy to shape his frustration into words. But now, all of that is gone. Burnout steals the final layer of expression, leaving behind a person who watches the world without engaging. Squidward's silence becomes a clinical portrait of emotional depletion, a snapshot of what happens when constant dissatisfaction finally drains a person's capacity to feel anything at all. And yet, this stillness is soothing in a way that is hard to explain. Not because it is comforting, but because it is honest. It reflects the version of adulthood most people experience in private. The version where exhaustion replaces anger, where numbness replaces motivation, where silence replaces every emotion that once felt too loud to handle. Squidward's quiet does not mock adulthood anymore. It understands it. Because silence is not Squidward's escape. It is his surrender, and that surrender becomes a turning point where the nostalgia you have been drifting through begins to fold inward. The memories that once floated across your mind like warm, harmless snapshots start to feel heavier, more reflective, almost diagnostic. You came back to Bikini Bottom searching for the comfort of childhood noise, but now the quiet rewrites the experience. It stops being a window into the past and becomes a mirror held up to the present. The town is not just silent, it is reflective, and in that reflection, you start to see parts of yourself that you usually ignore. This is the moment where nostalgia dissolves into self-awareness. You begin to realize that the episodes you once watched for fun now resemble the emotional landscape you walk through every day as an adult. The chaotic moments that felt goofy when you were young now look like distorted metaphors for anxiety. The jokes that once seemed harmless now echo with the strain of characters trying to hold themselves together. Even the bright colors feel like the kind of artificial cheer you use to mask exhaustion. When the noise disappears, the meaning becomes clearer, and that clarity points inward. The quiet forces this shift. It gives you space to hear the thoughts you usually drown out with background noise. You start recognizing your own burnout in Squidward's stillness. You recognize your old coping mechanisms in SpongeBob's exaggerated laughter. You recognize your confusion and hesitation in Patrick's frozen expression. These characters begin reflecting back parts of you that you never knew they contained, not because the show changed, but because you changed, and the silence finally reveals the emotional subtext you were too young to decode. As the nostalgia deepens, it becomes strangely therapeutic. You begin tracing the lines between who you were when you first watched these episodes and who you are now. The distance between those two versions of yourself becomes softer, less jarring. Instead of feeling disconnected from your childhood, You realize how many of your adult habits, fears, and comforts sprouted from those early moments spent in front of the TV. Bikini Bottom stops being an underwater city and starts becoming a map of your emotional evolution. Every character becomes a symbol. Every memory becomes data. Every quiet moment becomes a doorway to understanding the parts of yourself that still feel unfinished. This is why nostalgia becomes self reflection so easily. The silence creates a liminal space, a moment suspended between memory and meaning. When Bikini Bottom stops speaking, it creates room for your own inner voice to step forward. You start asking questions you never thought to ask. Why did the noise matter so much? Why did the chaos feel safe? Why does the quiet now make you uncomfortable in ways you cannot easily articulate? The past transforms into a tool not for escapism, but for introspection. And as you drift deeper into that introspection, the town begins to blur. It stops feeling like a place outside of you and starts feeling like an internal landscape, a representation of your emotional patterns. The silence becomes a loop that guides you back to yourself. You are no longer just watching a cartoon. You are analyzing your own relationship with comfort, with noise, with burnout, with memory. The nostalgia brings you in, but the reflection keeps you here. This loop closes just as another opens. If the quiet has changed the way you see Bikini Bottom, then it inevitably changes the way you see yourself. The characters no longer stand alone. They stand alongside the emotions you carry. The silence becomes a bridge between understanding them and understanding you. Because the quiet does not just expose Bikini Bottom, it exposes us. And that exposure turns the silence into something larger than a mood. It becomes a social phenomenon, the kind that sociologists study when entire communities lose their rhythm. What you are seeing now is not just a town being quiet, it is a city on pause, a full-scale behavioral freeze. In human terms, this is what happens in the aftermath of a blackout, when the usual sounds of life vanish and every person waits for someone else to make the first move. The absence of noise becomes a signal that the system has forgotten how to function. Bikini Bottom was once defined by routine. SpongeBob went to work. Patrick wandered. Squidward complained. Mr. Krabs chased money with the desperation of someone who feared losing even a single penny. These routines were the gears that kept the community turning. They created motion, they created contact, they created a sense of shared existence, but now all of that is suspended. You can feel it the same way you feel a city after a storm, when everyone stays inside and the streets look too empty to feel real. A world that once thrived on noise becomes a landscape of stalled interactions. This is where the sociology of the situation becomes impossible to ignore. When a community stops moving, the collapse is not loud. It is quiet. And that quiet reveals the fragility of the entire structure. Sociologists call this a behavioral freeze because everything that defines daily life suddenly becomes optional. Without noise, without routine, without the constant churn of relationships and reactions, a town begins to fold inward. It stops being an interconnected system and becomes a collection of disconnected spaces. Bikini Bottom looks exactly like that now, a city in which life has paused just long enough for the cracks to reveal themselves. You remember how alive it used to feel, the run cycles, the overlapping conversations, the chaotic movement that made every frame look like a living diagram of social energy. Even the smallest background characters contributed to the momentum. But the silence strips all of that away. It exposes how dependent the town was on constant activity, how easily its identity collapses when the noise disappears. The community is no longer behaving like a network. It behaves like a machine that has lost power, every function frozen mid-motion. This transformation feels strangely familiar because you have seen versions of it in your own life. You have experienced workplaces where one quiet week felt like a warning. You have lived through nights when group chats fell silent and suddenly the air felt heavier. You have felt friendships slow down until the pauses between messages lasted days. Human systems fall quiet in the same way this town has. Not all at once, but gradually, until the lack of movement becomes its own kind of presence. The stillness does not reassure. It unnerves. It tells you the infrastructure is weakening. And the longer you sit with this frozen city, the more it resembles a case study rather than a cartoon. The restaurants look abandoned. The houses feel uninhabited. Even the roads look like they're holding their breath. When the social structure disappears, the environment loses its meaning. Spaces designed for connection become empty shells. A town without interaction is not a town. It is architecture waiting for life to return. This is the hidden truth beneath the silence. Bikini Bottom is not just quiet. It is pause in the way cities pause before decline or before rebirth, suspended in a moment where nothing functions because nothing remembers how. Because no city survives long when its heartbeat stops, the silence eventually settles over the Krusty Krab, and that silence feels heavier than anywhere else in Bikini Bottom. This building was never just a restaurant. It was the economic core, the place where motion meant money and money meant life. Every sizzle of the fryer, every ding of the order window, every frantic scramble from Mr. Krabs created a rhythm that kept the town circulating. But now the rhythm is gone. The doors sit closed. The lights sit dim. The fryer oil cools into a stagnant pool. What was once an engine of constant production has slipped into stasis. The Krusty Krab in silence looks less like a business and more like a failed economic machine, a relic from a time when productivity was the only thing that kept the world spinning. You can almost picture the fryers as lungs, the registers as hearts, the sizzling patties as the pulse of the entire town. When those systems fall quiet, the building begins to resemble an abandoned factory, the kind you pass on the highway and wonder what stories were left behind. The stillness transforms the familiar into something clinical, something that resembles a post-capitalist ruin rather than a cartoon setting. You remember how alive it once felt. The frantic rushes, the impossible lunch lines, the clatter of trays and plates creating a kind of underwater industrial symphony. Even as a kid, you felt the energy. It was the kind of noise that made everything feel functional. Now, without that noise, the building looks like an artifact trapped in suspended decay. The neon sign flickers, not with excitement, but with the last remaining energy of a system that has lost its purpose. The absence of customers is not peaceful. It is diagnostic. It points to economic collapse. Mr. Krabs is the clearest indicator of that collapse. His entire identity was built on accumulation, on chasing pennies with the desperation of someone who feared scarcity even when abundance surrounded him. When even he stops moving, when even he loses interest in the next dollar, the silence becomes symbolic. It means the engine that powered this world has shut down. Either the Krusty Krab has finally exhausted itself after years of overproduction, or the economy of Bikini Bottom no longer values productivity at all. Either way, the outcome is the same. A system built on profit cannot survive when profit no longer motivates. Through the adult lens, the Krusty Krab becomes a metaphor for something far too familiar. It resembles workplaces that once buzzed with energy before burnout hollowed them out. It resembles offices where productivity slowed until the lights felt too bright and the air felt too thin. It resembles the moment you realized your job no longer fulfilled you, and the daily routine began to feel like a loop with no engine behind it. The silence inside the restaurant mirrors the silence inside those moments, the kind where economic failure and emotional fatigue blend together. Even the layout of the building starts to feel different. The tables look like abandoned workstations. The register looks like a machine waiting for input that will never come. The kitchen feels like an industrial heart that has forgotten how to pump. Without customers, without orders, without motion, everything looks staged, as if frozen mid-act. A place designed for constant churn becomes a tomb the moment the noise stops. The stillness strips away the illusion of prosperity and reveals the fragility underneath. And yet, there is something strangely soothing about analyzing this collapse from a distance. It lets you map your own anxieties onto a world that once felt simple. It lets you explore the fear of stagnation without confronting your own directly. The Krusty Krab becomes a safe place to examine the uncomfortable truth that economies, like people, sometimes reach a point where motion no longer makes sense. Because when money stops moving, everything else follows. And the next place where that truth becomes unavoidable is jellyfish fields. This landscape was always the opposite of stillness. It used to pulse with life, each jellyfish drifting like a floating lantern, each movement creating a soft shimmer across the plains. As a kid, the noise and color of this place felt endless. You could almost hear the hum of the jellyfish even through the TV, a constant reminder that nature in Bikini Bottom was always awake. But now the fields sit empty. No drifting, no pulsing, no soft glow passing through the water. The silence here feels biological, the kind of silence that signals not rest, but failure. The absence of motion in nature is never neutral. In environmental science, when an ecosystem falls quiet, it is considered a warning. Bees disappearing, birds falling silent, forests without insects. Each absence is a prophecy disguised as calm. Jellyfish Fields carries that same eerie prophecy now. Either the jellyfish have fled out of fear or they have exhausted themselves to the point of collapse. Both interpretations point to an ecosystem under stress, one that has lost the rhythm it depended on to function. The silence is not emptiness, it is evidence. You remember how this place once looked in the old episodes? The jellyfish moved like they were dancing, swirling through the currents in patterns that felt almost musical. SpongeBob and Patrick treated the fields like a playground, a living carnival of color and motion. Those scenes felt bright and harmless, but viewed through an adult lens, the motion mattered. It meant the ecosystem was working. It meant the biology of the world was intact. Removing that motion redefines everything. The empty fields now resemble the early stages of environmental collapse, a slow unraveling of life where the disappearance of one species signals a deeper imbalance lurking beneath the surface. This imbalance mirrors something familiar. You have seen it in real life, the quiet that falls over a place that has lost its energy. A neighborhood after factories close, a park after pollution spreads. Even in your own routines, when burnout hits hard enough, your internal ecosystem shuts down the same way. No creativity, no movement, no emotional pulse. Nature reflects people more than we admit. The jellyfish disappearing mirrors the way exhaustion removes pieces of your own life until you barely recognize the landscape of your days. The silence in Jellyfish Fields feels like that same kind of depletion. The grass sits untouched. The currents move without resistance. The space feels vast in a way it never did before, because nothing is occupying it. A world that cannot sustain its wildlife cannot sustain anything. If the jellyfish were the heartbeat of this environment, then their absence means the pulse has stopped. Either the ecosystem is resetting or it is failing. And when nature becomes this quiet, the line between the two grows thin. You can almost imagine the last jellyfish leaving, drifting away not out of instinct but out of necessity, as if the world around it no longer offered the biological support that once kept it alive. The absence becomes a message, one that says the environment is no longer functioning the way it was designed to. And the stillness that follows does not comfort. It warns, it speaks in the softest possible voice, but the message is unmistakable. Because when nature goes quiet, extinction is not far behind, and that same unsettling truth reaches the doors of the chum bucket. Plankton's absence lingers in the water like a missing note in a melody that cannot play without it. His schemes were never just comedy. They were the sparks that kept the town's emotional circuitry firing. Every failed plot, every chase scene, every desperate attempt to steal a formula created tension, and tension created motion. But tonight, there is no motion. No humming machines, no metallic clanking, no muttered monologues. The chum bucket sits as still as a mausoleum, and the silence radiating from it feels like a world forgetting its villain. Plankton's disappearances were always temporary, part of a cycle built on persistence. He lost, he regrouped, he tried again. That loop gave the town purpose. Because every system depends on opposition to define itself. Without conflict, narratives collapse. Without tension, stories drift. Plankton was the gravitational pull that gave meaning to Bikini Bottom's routines. His failures shaped SpongeBob's optimism. His stubbornness sharpened Mr. Krabs' greed. His loneliness highlighted the emotional gaps in the town's ecosystem. Removing him removes the counterweight that kept the social dynamics alive. What makes this quiet so unsettling is not the idea that Plankton is gone, but the idea that his role might no longer exist. The chum bucket is not just closed, it feels erased. There are no footprints in the sand, no faint glow from the laboratory windows, no tools left out as if he stepped away for a moment. The entire building rests in a state of suspended irrelevance, as if the world decided it no longer needed a villain and quietly removed him from the script. This absence does not feel like defeat, it feels like deletion. In psychology, absence is never neutral. When a disruptive force disappears, systems do not stabilize. They destabilize. Conflict is not chaos, it is structure. It provides direction and purpose even when it frustrates the characters involved. Without Plankton, the town loses the stimulus that kept energy flowing. The citizens no longer have anything to react to. SpongeBob has no mission to defend. Mr. Krabs has no threat to obsess over. Even Karen, Plankton's computer wife, seems swallowed by the stillness, as if her role only made sense in the presence of his ambition. You can feel how deeply this disrupts the emotional fabric of the show. As a child, Plankton was just a funny little villain who always messed up. As an adult, you realize he was the embodiment of persistence, of trying despite inevitable failure. He represented the part of you that keeps going even when success feels impossible. His absence leaves a psychological vacuum, a gap where determination once lived. Without that energy, the town does not simply quiet down. It loses direction. It loses narrative momentum. The silence around the chum bucket becomes symbolic. It stands for every situation where a problem disappears and leaves people unsure how to function without it. Workplaces where conflict stopped and purpose dissolved. Relationships where arguments ended but connection faded with them. Lives where goals vanished, leaving a strange emptiness in their place. Plankton's vanishing reflects all of that. He was not the heart of the town, but he was its friction, and without friction, nothing moves. This is the deeper meaning of his disappearance. It is not about villainy, it is about purpose. A world without an antagonist is a world without direction, and Bikini Bottom has entered the directionless hush. Because when a villain disappears, the world loses its reason to move. And in that motionless space, something strange begins to take shape. The silence no longer behaves like an accident. It behaves like intention, the way a room feels different when someone has cleaned it too perfectly, too precisely, leaving no trace of chaos behind. At first, the quiet looked like a glitch in Bikini Bottom's rhythm, a random pause in a world built on noise. But the longer we sit with it, the more coordinated it feels. The stillness across every system, every character, every corner of the ocean begins to align in a pattern that is too neat to ignore. If you are still awake while listening to this deep into the timeline, know that it is okay. Sleep will come. You can let the story carry you the rest of the way. The silence does not scatter itself randomly. It lands in specific places at specific moments, like someone placing pieces on a board with careful, deliberate hands. Social routines froze first, then economic engines stalled, then nature pulled back its pulse. Each collapse happened in sequence, almost like an instruction followed rather than an accident unfolding. It creates a feeling you recognize from late night thoughts, the kind where you cannot shake the idea that something unseen is shaping the world around you, not violently, but quietly, methodically, as if guiding everything toward a pause. This is not panic, it is curiosity, softened by fatigue. You can feel the narrative tilting toward a question rather than an answer. What if the silence was not a malfunction, but a directive? What if the town did not fall quiet on its own? What if something nudged it into stillness the way your mind nudges you toward rest when exhaustion becomes too heavy to ignore? Bikini Bottom feels as if it has been placed under a dome of quiet by a force that understands exactly how much noise this world could tolerate before it began to fracture. You start to notice the symmetry. The Krusty Krab did not just stop functioning, it stopped with the same precision that jellyfish fields did. Squidward's dissociation mirrors the same emotional shutdown happening across the community. Even the chum bucket's eerie vacancy aligns with the same rhythm of disappearance. The silence spreads like a perfectly timed wave, rolling outward in even intervals. This is not how chaos behaves. Chaos is messy. This is too synchronized, too smooth, too complete. And that completeness becomes its own kind of whisper, a whisper that says the town did not choose this. Something chose it for them. The question growing in the background is not who caused the silence, but why. Was the world protecting itself? Was it resetting? Was it preparing for something? The possibilities drift in slow, gentle circles, each one soothingly strange, each one wide enough to hold your imagination without sharpening into fear. This is the loop opening again, pulling you from analysis into wonder. The silence becomes less of a void and more of a suggestion, a sign that the world is shifting into a new phase. You can sense the narrative widening, preparing for whatever comes next, the way a deep breath expands before it softens into an exhale. Because silence, this complete never happened by accident, the next question forms almost automatically. If the quiet feels intentional, then what is it doing to the minds of the people living inside it? In psychology, humans have 3 trauma responses: fight, flight, and freeze. And what we are witnessing in Bikini Bottom is not resistance or escape. It is pure freeze. An entire city slipping into the same instinct at the same moment, as if every resident reached the identical conclusion without saying a word. They do not scream, they do not run, they do not push back, they simply stop. The way a mind stops when the threat becomes too large to process. This is not peace. It's paralysis wrapped in silence. You can feel the difference. Peace has softness. Freeze has weight. The stillness here presses down on every street and every home as if the town is trying to make itself smaller, quieter, harder to find. In trauma studies, the freeze response is the least understood because it looks like nothing from the outside. It masquerades as calm, but internally it is fear reorganizing itself into survival mode. When a person freezes, they shift into invisibility. They wait for danger to pass, but what does it mean when an entire community makes that choice all at once? You start to notice how synchronized their responses look. SpongeBob is not laughing. Patrick is not wandering. Squidward is not complaining. These are the behavioral markers of freeze, the signs that thought and action have been suspended until the world feels safe again. The quiet stops feeling random. It begins to look like a collective psychological reflex. A town does not normally fall into the same emotional state unless something unspoken has rippled through it, something powerful enough to silence every routine and every instinct except the one designed to protect. Think about how freeze works in your own life. There are nights when anxiety becomes so overwhelming that you cannot run from it or fight it anymore. You go still. You stop responding. You let the moment hover over you because movement feels impossible. That exhaustion, shaped into paralysis, is exactly what Bikini Bottom reflects now. The town behaves like a mind under pressure, retreating inward to avoid breaking completely. It is not choosing invisibility, it is suffering invisibility. And that is what makes this silence different from the ones that came before. Earlier, the quiet felt nostalgic, introspective, eerie. Now it feels clinical. You can almost diagnose it. The town's posture, its lack of reaction, its frozen routines all point towards psychological overwhelm. In trauma theory, freeze is a last resort. It is what happened when the first two responses have been exhausted, fight has failed, flight has nowhere to go. All that remains is the instinct to disappear into stillness and hope that stillness becomes safety. The buildings look like they're holding their breath. The streets look like they're waiting for permission to move. Even the ocean currents feel paused, as if participating in the same shared mindset. This collective freeze transforms the town into a single organism, responding to a threat unseen by the viewer. The threat does not need to be shown. The reaction tells the story. Something overwhelmed the system so completely that paralysis became the only option left. And strangely, understanding this makes the silence feel less terrifying and more familiar. People watching this late at night know what it feels like to freeze. They know the sensation of going still when their thoughts grow too loud or when the world becomes too heavy. Seeing an entire town enter that same state turns their own paralysis into something understandable, something normal, something shared. Because sometimes survival looks like becoming invisible, the silence naturally turns your attention toward the one character who was never meant to disappear. SpongeBob was not just noise. He was regulation. He was the town's emotional stabilizer, the unofficial nervous system that kept everything functioning even when nothing made sense. His optimism acted like a buffer, absorbing the chaos so no one else had to. His routines provided a structure that everyone unconsciously relied on. His laugh stitched the loose threads of daily life into something that resembled coherence. Tonight, he is still, silent, absent, and the absence of the regulator creates a ripple that spreads through the entire ecosystem. When a nervous system loses its central signal, everything attached to it begins to drift. That is what Bikini Bottom feels like now, drifting, uncoordinated, detached from the internal rhythm that once held it steady. SpongeBob's energy was the metronome. His predictability was the pulse. Even his immaturity provided emotional contrast for the others to navigate. Without him, the town does not simply lose a character. It loses orientation. It loses its sense of direction. It loses the emotional scaffolding that kept its fragile dynamics from collapsing under their own weight. Think about the people in your life who play that same role. The friend who always keeps the conversation moving. The coworker who softens tense moments. The family member who absorbs stress so others do not explode. You do not realize how much stability they provide until they grow quiet. And when they do, the silence is immediate and unsettling, because it exposes how much of the emotional load they were carrying in the first place. SpongeBob's sudden stillness functioned exactly like that. It reveals how dependent the town was on its constant output of joy. Through an adult lens, his old behavior looks almost neurobiological. He regulated others by regulating himself. When he laughed, the town breathed. When he moved, the world reacted. When he worked, others found purpose in relation to him. He was not just a character, but a reference point, a compass, a steady signal that kept everyone aligned. Remove that signal and the system begins to glitch, patterns fall apart, routine stops cycling. The world grows quiet not because it wants quiet, but because the energy source went offline. This is why the silence feels heavier around him. SpongeBob's joy was not optional. It was functional. It was woven into the identity of the town. Losing it is like losing the heartbeat that once kept the entire environment regulated. The other characters freeze because they do not know how to operate without him. Patrick loses direction. Squidward loses resistance. Mr. Krabs loses ambition. Each collapse maps back to SpongeBob's emotional shutdown, as if every part of the town depended on him more than they ever admitted. And this mirrors something painfully real about adulthood. Many people become the emotional glue in their families or friend groups without realizing it. They give energy, cheer, optimism, stability, until one day their internal battery runs out. When they finally fall quiet, the whole system around them falters, not out of malice, but out of dependence. SpongeBob embodies that experience. His stillness reveals the cost of being the one who always holds everyone else together. The quiet is not random. It is a chain reaction that began the moment the emotional center collapsed, SAS. And once the center falls, the world follows. Because when the emotional center collapses, the world collapses with it, and nowhere is that collapse more intimate, more unavoidable than inside Squidward's apartment. His home has always been quiet, but this quiet feels weighted, like the air has thickened, just enough to make every breath for it feel deliberate. The walls do not simply stand. They sag with resignation, the kind that builds over years of disappointment until even the structure around you begins to imitate your posture. His furniture sits perfectly arranged not out of pride, but out of habit, like a museum display curated by someone who no longer remembers why the pieces mattered in the first place. Stepping into this space feels like stepping into emotional numbness itself. Psychologists call this learned helplessness, the moment when a person stops trying because every previous attempt has convinced them that effort is pointless. And Squidward embodies that surrender. The silence is not chosen. It is inherited from a long lineage of dashed hopes and stalled ambitions. His clarinet rests untouched in a corner, not because he is saving it for later, but because later no longer carries meaning. The dim lighting is not atmospheric. It is a symptom of someone who stopped caring whether the room felt alive. You can sense how his environment mirrors the internal collapse. The sofa looks barely used, the kind of furniture owned by someone who sits without relaxing. The kitchen is too clean, the cleanliness of a man who eats out of necessity, not joy. Even the artwork lining the walls feels like a gallery of failed versions of himself. Each portrait a reminder of the creative life he imagined but could never reach. This is not a home. It is a waiting room for a future he quietly stopped believing would arrive. And yet the numbness here feels strangely familiar. You have walked into your own room after long weeks of burnout and felt the same heaviness, the same emotional static humming in the background. Squidward's apartment resembles that exact emotional landscape, the one where you move through your space without engaging with it, where everything feels slightly faded around the edges. His stillness is not laziness, it is survival. The kind of survival that happens when the mind retreats because continuing to care would hurt too much. The silence amplifies this truth. It fills every corner of the room, turning ordinary objects into symbols of surrender. The closed blinds suggest avoidance. The empty table suggests isolation. The untouched easel suggests lost purpose. And the lack of motion suggests a deeper shutdown, as if Squidward has reached the point where even disappointment requires too much effort. This is emotional exhaustion in its final form, where numbness replaces frustration and surrender replaces resistance. But what makes this scene powerful is not the sadness, it is the recognition. Viewers see pieces of themselves reflected here, the exhaustion they carry, the dreams they set aside, the days when they move through life on autopilot because feeling anything more would be overwhelming. Squidward's apartment becomes a mirror, but a soft one, a mirror that does not judge or frighten. It simply acknowledges the emotional truth of burnout in a way that feels strangely comforting. His stillness is not empty. It is everything he has given up on, and everything the viewer has quietly given up on too. Because silence is not emptiness. It is everything someone has surrendered, and that surrender brings us to a crossroads that feels impossibly gentle and impossibly heavy at the same time. The quiet in Bikini Bottom no longer exists as background noise or atmospheric tension. It has become a question, and the question shapes itself into a binary so simple that it feels hypnotic. Either this silence is healing or it is warning. Either the town is resting or it is failing. Both interpretations cannot coexist, yet both feel equally true, suspended in the same unmoving water. You feel this dilemma the way you feel late night uncertainty settle into your own mind. Sometimes you fall quiet because peace finally finds you, and sometimes you fall quiet because you can no longer carry the weight of sound. The outward behavior is identical, but the inward truth is entirely different. Bikini Bottom sits in that same emotional overlap. Its stillness could be recovery after years of chaos, a needed breath, a soft reset, or it could be the first symptom of collapse, the moment a system shuts down because it cannot sustain itself anymore. The silence is either medicine or decline. The trick is that both feel soothing until you look closely enough to tell the difference. And yet, in this moment, you are not asked to decide. You are simply asked to sit inside the ultimatum. The quiet stretches across the town with the same softness as a blanket being pulled over something fragile. The buildings do not look abandoned. They look paused. The streets do not look empty. They look suspended. It is as though the entire environment is caught between inhale and exhale, unsure whether the next breath will be relief or resignation. This uncertainty becomes strangely comforting because it mirrors the uncertainty inside you. You recognize this feeling. You have lived in this exact emotional limbo before. The binary becomes soothing precisely because it limits the possibilities. Instead of spiraling through endless interpretations, the silence offers only two: healing or warning, recovery or collapse, peace or danger. The simplicity calms the mind in a way that complexity never could. You drift into the dilemma as if you are drifting into a dream where meaning is softened, where edges blur, where choices feel like shapes rather than demands. The tension becomes a lullaby rather than a threat. You start examining the evidence the same way you examine your own quiet days. Does the stillness feel intentional, like a body choosing rest after too much movement? Or does it feel imposed, like a body shutting down because it no longer has the strength to continue? The signs point in both directions. The lack of chaos could be healing. The lack of motion could be collapse. The emotional numbness around Squidward could signal recovery from overstimulation, or it could signal exhaustion reaching its final stage. Every interpretation folds into its opposite, creating a loop where clarity becomes impossible and peacefulness becomes inevitable. This is the paradox of silence. It has a purpose, but the purpose is rarely obvious. It can protect or conceal. It can comfort or warn. It can mean renewal or disappearance. And Bikini Bottom's stillness carries that perfect ambiguity, inviting you into a space where interpretation becomes introspection. You are not just observing the town. You are projecting your own emotional patterns onto it, seeing your own pauses reflected in its frozen state. Because every silence has a purpose, but not every purpose brings peace. The atmosphere around Bikini Bottom begins to tilt in a way that feels almost imperceptible at first. The quiet no longer behaves like something pressing down on the town from the outside. It behaves like something rising from within the characters themselves, as if the stillness is no longer an environmental blanket, but an internal release. The town is not being silenced. The town is generating silence. SpongeBob's absence of laughter, Patrick's contemplative pause, Squidward's emotional surrender, these are not reactions to the quiet. They are the source of it. You can feel the shift the same way you feel it inside yourself when your thoughts fall mute. Not because the world is calm, but because your mind has reached a point where sound is no longer possible. Silence that originates within a person carries a different weight. It is softer, but heavier, thinner, but more meaningful. It spreads outward the way fog does, not in aggressive waves, but in gentle layers that stack over one another until visibility disappears without you noticing when it happened. The stillness moving through Bikini Bottom resembles emotional fog, something exhaled rather than imposed. SpongeBob, who once radiated noise like a sun, now radiates stillness. His quiet leaks into the streets, into the currents, into the shadows of the buildings. Patrick's silence does not sit inside his rock. It expands, sliding under doorways, filling the gaps between grains of sand. Squidward's numbness sinks into the walls of his home and vibrates outward, almost like a tuning fork of resignation humming beneath the entire neighborhood. The silence they generate becomes collective, not because they coordinate it, but because emotional states spread. Fear spreads, confidence spreads, exhaustion spreads, stillness spreads too. This is where the loop begins to close. We started with the silence as an external force, something happening to the town, but now we see it as something happening within the town. And with that perspective shift comes a deeper question forming in the background. If silence can originate inside these characters, then what does it mean when silence originates inside us? When the quiet we feel late at night is not from the room, but from some internal place that stops sending signals. The town becomes a metaphor for the viewer's own emotional patterns, the way stillness grows inside you when you are overwhelmed, burnt out, or simply tired beyond language. The quiet becomes less of a plot point and more of an internal landscape. Each character demonstrates a different form of emotional withdrawal. SpongeBob shows overcorrection collapsing into shutdown. Patrick shows confusion deepening into introspection. Squidward shows exhaustion crystallizing into numbness. Their silence is not absence, it is expression. It is the emotional residue of everything they have been carrying, finally settling into place. And once you see silence as something born rather than imposed, the narrative opens into a different dimension. This is the beginning of the next loop. The external examination becomes internal reflection. The question becomes quieter, more personal, the kind that floats into your mind only when the lights are low and your thoughts have softened into something slower. If silence can emerge from within them, can it emerge from within us too? Do we create quiet when our emotions run out of volume? Do we broadcast stillness when our internal systems fall offline for a moment? The characters become guides in this loop, showing how internal states shape external worlds. Because some silences are broadcast and some are born, the quiet settling over Bikini Bottom begins to feel less like a disruption and more like a message we were never taught how to read. As children, our eyes stayed glued to the bright colors, the loud jokes, the endless motion. We didn't pay attention to anything that happened in between. The pauses felt invisible. The breath before the punchline felt meaningless. The empty corners of the Krusty Krab or the lonely stretches of jellyfish fields were nothing more than background art. We weren't ignoring the silence. We were too young to notice it existed. But adulthood changes the way we hear the world. Suddenly, the gaps feel louder than the jokes. The quiet moments carry weight. The small hesitations inside an episode feel like emotional clues we missed the first time around. When you listen to Bikini Bottom now, the silence behaves like a message hidden in plain sight, a soft whisper layered beneath the nostalgia. It tells you that life was always more complicated than you realized. The world you thought was noisy had silence woven through it from the beginning. You just weren't old enough to interpret it. The quiet forces you to re-examine these memories through an adult lens. The bright colors that once felt cheerful now have shadows hidden behind them. The laughter that once felt effortless now reads like a coping mechanism. The stillness in Squidward's eyes. The long pauses in Patrick's thought process. The flicker of uncertainty in SpongeBob's smile all feel different now. Not darker, but deeper. The silence doesn't reveal tragedy, it reveals dimension. Layers that were always there, but remained invisible until life gave you the vocabulary to understand them. This is the strange gift of revisiting childhood worlds as an adult. You start noticing what the show didn't say. The breath between jokes, the empty frames where no character speaks, the quiet streets that appear between scenes. Those moments used to be filler, but now they feel intentional, like emotional punctuation. They are the places where the story pauses long enough for you to breathe, or to think, or to feel something unspoken. The silence becomes a teacher, reminding you that not everything meaningful is loud. And maybe that is the point the quiet has been trying to make all along. Maybe it wasn't an accident that these silent pockets existed inside such a chaotic show. Maybe the world of Bikini Bottom was always designed with a contrast, noise balanced with stillness, chaos softened by calm. As children, we gravitated toward the chaos. As adults, we gravitate toward the calm. The same scenes we once played for the excitement now soothe us because we finally understand the importance of the space between the sound. There is something soft about realizing this, something comforting. The silence invites you to sit with the version of yourself who watched these episodes years ago and to understand them in a new way. It bridges the distance between past and present, between innocence and experience. The quiet becomes a translator, helping your adult mind make sense of the feelings you didn't have language for when you were young. Because the things we ignored as kids become the things we finally understand as adults, the ocean surrounding Bikini Bottom begins to sound different, or rather, it begins to not sound at all. The water feels older tonight, slower, heavy in a way that does not come from weight but from weariness, as if the sea itself has been carrying a burden it never had the language to express. When you listen closely, the silence in the water isn't empty. It is a whisper, a tired exhale from a world that has been running on borrowed energy for far too many years. As children, we never imagined the ocean could feel tired. It was just scenery, a blue backdrop that held the story together. But adulthood teaches you that even the things that look infinite wear down over time. The water drifting around Bikini Bottom moves like someone walking home after a long shift, not because they want to be slow, but because speed is no longer an option. It feels like burnout translated into current and tide, a living organism reaching the point where motion becomes something it performs rather than something it feels. You begin to realize the ocean has always been the quiet witness to everything happening in this world. It watched the chaos. It absorbed the noise. It held the weight of every joke, every chase, every explosion of color and sound. And now, in the stillness, it finally reveals how much that constant pressure cost. The silence becomes a sigh, the kind you release when you are finally alone in your room after pretending to be fine all day. The water settles the same way people do when they reach the edge of their emotional capacity. Not dramatically, but quietly, gently, in a way that threatens to break your heart if you listen too long. This reframing turns the ocean into a mirror. Its exhaustion is not distant. It is painfully familiar. You have felt this version of tired before, the kind where the world keeps demanding movement, but your internal energy no longer rises to meet it. You keep going anyway because that is what life expects. And yet, somewhere inside, you long for a moment where silence gives you permission to stop. The ocean is taking that moment now. Its stillness reads like an overdue break, the pause that should have happened years earlier but never did because everything else needed it to stay in motion. In this quiet, Bikini Bottom's sea stops being the comedic backdrop you remember. It becomes a metaphor for the kind of burnout that does not announce itself with panic or collapse, but with subtle heaviness. The heaviness that settles in your chest after too many responsibilities. The heaviness that gathers behind your eyes after too little rest. The heaviness that shapes your voice into something softer because loudness requires a strength you no longer have. The ocean communicates that heaviness without a single wave rising, without a single current shifting. And somehow, that realization does not frighten you. It comforts you. It gives you permission to acknowledge your own tiredness without judgment. If even a world built for comedy can grow exhausted, then so can you. The silence becomes a gentle affirmation that rest is not failure, it is survival. The water is not giving up. It is simply admitting the truth. Because even the brightest worlds have breaking points, the characters who once felt frozen in time begin to look different in the quiet. Not older in appearance, but older in presence, as if their emotional age has finally caught up to the years we've spent growing alongside them. SpongeBob is not the same sponge you met when you were a child. Patrick is not the same starfish. Squidward, especially, is not the same man. And the truth that settles in with the silence is simple but profound. They have been aging with us even if their world never acknowledged it out loud. When you were young, you saw their noise as personality. SpongeBob's laugh meant joy. Patrick's shouting meant comedy. Squidward's sighing meant grumping it at us. Everything felt clear, easy, uncomplicated. But adulthood has a way of sharpening your hearing. Now, in the stillness, the things they aren't saying ring louder than the things they once shouted. Silence reveals emotional realities that were always there but slipped beneath the radar of childhood perception. You realize SpongeBob's endless optimism sometimes looked a lot like emotional labor. You realize Patrick's simplicity sometimes looked a lot like someone hiding confusion behind humor. You realize Squidward's bitterness sometimes looked like exhaustion no one bothered to care about. It's not that the characters have changed, it's that the viewer has. You hear them differently because you have lived enough life to finally understand the weight behind their behaviors. Their silence mirrors your own journey from innocence into complexity, from laughter into coping, from energy into fatigue. Bikini Bottom becomes a kind of emotional mirror, reflecting back the transitions you never realized you were making. SpongeBob's quieter moments hit differently now because you know what it feels like to force positivity on days when you simply don't have the strength. Patrick's blank stares resemble moments when your mind freezes under stress. Squidward's numbness resembles the emotional burnout adults collect without meaning to. In this light, the silence becomes a shared experience rather than a narrative twist. You and the characters sit in the same emotional space for the first time. Their quiet does not signal disappearance. It signals understanding. They are not losing their voices. You're gaining the ability to hear the tones they always carried underneath the noise. The bright chaos that once defined the show now feels like a memory of childhood resilience, and the quiet now feels like the natural evolution into adult awareness. You used to need the loudness to feel safe. Now you need the silence to feel seen. There is something comforting about that realization. It softens the distance between you and the characters, reminding you that growing up does not erase the worlds you loved. It deepens them. It allows you to return to them with new meaning, with new emotional vocabulary, with a sense that these characters have been waiting for you to understand them in a new way. Their quiet does not mean they're fading. It means they have more to say than you once knew how to hear. And maybe that is the quiet's true purpose. Not to unsettle you, but to reveal everything you missed as a child. The cracks, the pauses, the hesitations, the emotions that hid behind the noise. You hear them now because you have lived enough life to finally understand. Because the quiet isn't them changing, it's us noticing. The silence settles into its final shape, not as an atmosphere, not as a symptom, but as a question. The kind of question that only appears when a world has slowed down enough for you to hear the difference between stillness and conclusion. We arrive at a crossroads that feels both delicate and enormous. Silence can mean nightfall, the soft dimming of a world that has grown too tired to continue. Or silence can mean transformation, the breath a universe takes before shifting into a new form. Both possibilities hover over Bikini Bottom in perfect balance, neither overpowering the other, each one whispering its own truth. This is the final binary, the ultimate logic trap that feels soothing instead of stressful because it removes the need for messy explanations. The quiet is either an ending or a beginning, a fading light or a forming dawn, one cycle closing or another preparing to open. Both cannot be true, yet the silence carries the weight of both interpretations so gracefully that you begin to understand how endings and beginnings often feel identical, until hindsight tells you which one you lived through. The ambiguity becomes a soft pillow for the mind, giving you permission to rest inside possibility without choosing a side. You look around Bikini Bottom and notice how the stillness could belong to either narrative. The dim lights could signal decline, like a city shutting itself down piece by piece. But they could also resemble early morning quiet, the hush that comes before the first sign of renewal. SpongeBob's absence of laughter could feel like collapse, or it could feel like rest. Patrick's contemplative stillness could signal cognitive retreat or awakening. Squidward's numb posture could be surrender or recovery. Every interpretation splits into two, each one plausible, each one tender in its own way. This is the beauty of the final binary. It invites you to choose the meaning that brings you the most comfort. If you need silence to be an ending, the town allows that interpretation. It offers the softness of closure, the feeling that everything can finally stop struggling. If you need silence to be transformation, the town allows that too. It offers the promise that tomorrow could look different, lighter, calmer. The stillness becomes a blank slate rather than a tomb. The quiet becomes a prelude rather than a goodbye. You begin recognizing this same binary in your own life. Nights when your exhaustion feels like the end of something important, but also nights when that same exhaustion feels like the first step toward healing. Moments where your silence feels like collapse, and moments where it feels like growth hiding beneath the surface. You realize that the emotional crossroads Bikini Bottom sits upon is one you visited many times without naming it. Your mind softens at the recognition. The parallel makes you feel less alone. In this sense, the silence becomes a companion rather than an adversary. It sits with you, unthreatening and unhurried, asking only that you acknowledge what it represents. Not certainty, but possibility. Not fear, but openness. The ambiguity becomes soothing because it mirrors the gentle uncertainty of drifting toward sleep, where endings and beginnings blur into the same soft darkness. The town does not demand clarity from you. It invites you to rest inside the question. Because every ending sounds like silence until something begins, the quiet settles over everything one final time. Not as a question now, not as a warning, but as a companion. The same hush that felt eerie when we first entered this world now feels soft enough to rest in. It wraps itself around the town like a blanket pulled up at the end of a long day, the kind of calm that asks nothing of you except that you breathe. We return to the silence exactly the way we began, except now it carries a different meaning. It is not emptiness, it is completion. At the start of this journey, the stillness felt foreign, almost clinical. It looked like a malfunction in a world built on noise. But somewhere along the way, the quiet shifted its shape. It led us into memory, nudging old feelings awake. It led us into reflection, revealing truths we once overlooked. It led us into understanding, offering every character and every shadow a deeper, softer meaning. And now, with the story drawing to its natural edge, the silence becomes the path out, guiding us as gently as it guided us in. This is the loop completing itself. The quiet that opened the door now closes it, slowly, patiently, the way the ocean fades into low tide without announcing its departure. You feel yourself drifting with it, not resisting, not questioning, but following the rhythm of a world that no longer needs sound to be understood. SpongeBob's stillness, Patrick's pause, Squidward's surrender, the town's frozen breath, all of it settles into a final moment where nothing needs to move anymore. The silence holds everything. And you begin to realize that this was the purpose all along. The quiet wasn't a mystery waiting to be solved. It was an atmosphere inviting you inward, guiding you through layers of memory and meaning until you reach a place where the noise of your own day could finally dissolve. The stillness is the story's exhale, and in listening to it, your own breath begins to slow. The town does not disappear. It simply grows dimmer, softer, like a room where the lights have been lowered because it is finally time to rest. This is not an ending. It is a continuation in a different register, a chapter closing itself with a whisper instead of a signature. Silence becomes a way of carrying you, not pushing you, a way of telling you that it is safe to let go of the noise, safe to drift, safe to slip into whatever quiet your body has been asking for. The story does not demand anything more from you. It simply settles beside you and keeps watch. And as Bikini Bottom fades into its gentle stillness, you are left with the soft echo of everything we uncovered. The memories, the shadows, the reflections, the possibilities. All of it held in a silence that no longer feels empty but full. Full of what you saw, full of what you felt, full of what you finally allowed yourself to understand. The quiet becomes the bridge from this world back into your own, just as it was the bridge from your world into theirs. Because the story doesn't end. It just becomes quiet. If you enjoyed our video, subscribe to SpongeBob Sleep Stories for more videos like these.